people have been using drugs for thousands and thousands of years. But the level of prohibition that we know today, it's been around for 100 years, maybe less. I just want to know what have been the effects. Let's just talk about cannabis for now.
Sure. I mean, the history of cannabis prohibition, I mean, you can trace it back further. You know, there were I think the earliest prohibitions were in the 18th century, but modern cannabis prohibition probably began at the beginning of last century and was kind of formalized as a global policy structure in 1961 with the UN Single Convention on Drugs, which prohibited cannabis and a number of other drugs, including coca and opium and related drugs. And that became essentially a global policy. So cannabis has been criminalized and prohibited for longer, but as a global policy, 1961 is kind of the beginning. And other countries then incorporated the UN drug conventions into their domestic law in the years that followed, including in the UK. We have the 1971 Misuse of Drugs Act, for example. Now, the idea of those prohibitions is to deter people from using cannabis and to direct, but by criminalizing that activity and punishing people who use cannabis, whether it's by a criminal record or in many cases imprisonment, and also to prevent access to cannabis by directing enforcement resources at supply. So you would, interdict drug trafficking into a particular country. If people are growing it, you arrest them and prosecute them and so on. So supply side and demand side, you have a punitive enforcement model, and the goal was to prevent people from using cannabis and ultimately eradicate cannabis markets entirely, get rid of it. And these are rhetorically, the commitment is to create a drug-free world. In this case, a cannabis-free world, but actually it applies to all drugs. Now, on those terms, it's been a quite staggering failure, because clearly since 1961, levels of cannabis consumption have risen pretty consistently, not just in Malta or in the UK, but globally. So you can see there's a clear rise in the level of cannabis use, and in fact, use of all drugs over that period. So on its own terms, it's delivered the exact opposite of its stated goal. So it hasn't got rid of it hasn't eradicated drug markets, and it hasn't reduced drug use. Cannabis use has increased for every one of those 60 or 70 years since that policy came online. Yet it's been incredibly expensive for the taxpayer, for governments. They have spent literally billions and billions of euros fighting this war against cannabis, and yet it's delivered the complete opposite of what it was supposed to. But it's worse than that, because it's also led to the criminalization of millions of people. So literally millions of people have received criminal records. Many hundreds of thousands of people have ended up in prison. And at the same time, we've enriched and empowered organized crime groups who supply much of the cannabis. Now, not all suppliers of cannabis are gangsters and organized crime groups, but a significant part of the market is controlled by organized crime groups who are involved in a lot of other, arguably much worse things: people trafficking, extortion, counterfeiting, arms smuggling, all kinds of unpleasant things. So it's not only failed on its own terms, but it's had this raft of negative consequences, personal consequences of criminalization, but not just for people who use cannabis, for the whole of the community, because it enriches and empowers organized crime groups, and it's an economic burden on the state, because we spend all this money fighting a war on drugs, and yet it then creates additional costs to society. So on almost any metric you could choose, whether it's public health, whether it's criminal justice, whether it's human rights, whether it's environmental sustainability, cannabis prohibition has been a total, unmitigated disaster.
Regarding all this, many states in the US, many countries are moving beyond this. They are allowing the recreational and medical use of cannabis. But correct me if I'm wrong, we discussed this. Malta's model, which was recently introduced, is one of the few models which prohibits commercialization. What do you make of this model when you think about commercialization in the tobacco industry, in the alcohol industry, but not the cannabis industry? What do you think about this emphasis on no commercialization?
I mean, I very much welcome the approach being taken in Malta, which feels to me like they've learnt the lessons from mistakes that we have made with alcohol and tobacco in particular, where you have products which are associated with risks, health risks, including dependence and other forms of health harms, and they are saying we cannot have a situation where big corporations are shaping our policy in the interests of their private profit instead of in the interests of the public good, whether it's public health or human rights or sustainable development or whatever it is. And there are clear risks with commercialization of a product which is associated with public health risks, including potentially dependence. You know, and we've seen with alcohol and tobacco, you have a small number of companies, maybe 4 or 5 alcohol companies, 4 or 5 tobacco companies. They control 80% globally of those industries. And when you have that much money and that much power, they have the ability to deploy their lawyers, their lobbyists, and their other forms of influence to shape policy in their interests, not in our interests, not in the interests of the public or in public health, but in the interests of their bank balance, in terms of maximizing their profit. So they will fight against any regulation. If you try to put a ban on advertising, they will fight it. If you try to put health warnings on packaging, they will fight it. They will use their lawyers, they deploy all kinds of fake science and all of these tricks that we've seen with the alcohol and tobacco industry through time. Now, we need to be very careful to not repeat those mistakes with cannabis. Now, I don't think cannabis is as risky as alcohol or tobacco, but it is not risk-free. It's not risk-free. There are, particularly for youth, particularly for people who are using strong cannabis on a very regular basis, for people who are pregnant, for people who are driving, there are risks, and we need to be mindful of that and manage and regulate cannabis markets, cannabis sales, cannabis products, cannabis use. We need to regulate that responsibly. And those decisions need to be made by public health experts, not by industry. Because if industry are making those decisions, they are doing it for the wrong reasons, i.e. making money. So one of the things I very much welcome about Malta is they've established a model based where you can access cannabis either through home growing or through one of the new not-for-profit associations. You can join as a member and access a regulated cannabis products. But there won't be a retail commercial market. So there won't be stores on the high street you can just wander into and buy cannabis, which does happen in Canada and many of the US states. And we are having an interesting time because there is cannabis reforms happening in around 20 or 30 different jurisdictions all across the world now. South Africa, Thailand, Canada, Uruguay, Mexico, 21 states in the US, including California. They're all adopting different models. Some of them are more commercial, some of them are not commercial, like in Malta, some of them are sort of half and half, like in Uruguay, where you have home growing, not-for-profit associations and a retail model, but the retail model is kind of a state monopoly, kind of controlled by the government. So you can only buy unbranded products sold in pharmacies. It's kind of like a laboratory of change. We've got all these different models and we can look at them and learn. So countries that are coming to this debate fresh can say, okay, what's working in Colorado? What's working in Canada? What's working in Uruguay? What's working in Malta? and you can see from the mistakes and successes of those different policies, we can learn and evolve our understanding on how to do this right. Because I think that's where the debate is now. It's not should we legalise and regulate cannabis, but how do we do it the right way? How do we do it responsibly? How do we do it in ways that serve the interests of the public good without risking public health consequences? Because there is a risk, if we allowed commercial cannabis operators to do some of the things that alcohol and tobacco do now or have done historically, like say sponsoring sports teams, which still happens with alcohol, or sponsoring racing, driving events, which again still happens with alcohol. The tobacco companies used to sponsor the Olympics. Alcohol companies still do sponsor the Olympics. These things in many ways are extraordinary, offensive and stupid. If you looked at objectively, the idea that you would have alcohol companies, alcohol, a drug which kills thousands of people, tens of thousands of people a year, and is responsible for car crashes and violence and family abuse and all kinds of unpleasant things, that they would be allowed to sponsor sports events that are consumed by children and young people, aggressively marketing risky products to children. It's ridiculous. So now I don't think we're going to be doing that with no cannabis jurisdictions are doing that now. Even the most commercialized ones in the US, they still have very strict regulation of advertising and branding. You're not allowed to advertise to youth. Sometimes people try, but but in Malta we have nothing. There's nothing like that. There won't be commercialization. There won't be billboards advertising cannabis products.
And you mentioned that Malta, before we started, you mentioned that Malta, the Maltese model is being discussed by a few countries.
Yes, well, I mean, the Maltese model, partly because they were the first EU state to make this move, and partly because what Malta is doing is really quite different to the more high-profile North American commercial models. The Maltese model is actually getting a lot of attention. Not just in Europe, but internationally. So every year there's a big meeting at the UN called the Commission on Narcotic Drugs. And the last 2 years I've been attending that meeting, Malta's model has been a subject of considerable interest and discussion on the international stage. I was in Brazil last week at a meeting in the Brazilian Congress in Brasilia. It was a big meeting on regulation of cannabis. And it was attended by the Minister of Agriculture and the Brazilian drug czar and a number of Congress people and the Senate. And Brazil's a huge country. It's like 300 times the size of population of Malta. I mean, it's a huge and very powerful, influential economy and, on the international stage. They were talking about the Maltese model in Brazil. So Malta, whether they like it or not, whether they want it or not, Malta has now a leadership role, not just within Europe, but globally in this debate. In the cannabis debate, Malta is, people are talking about it, and they have a leadership role, and there is a lot of attention on Malta. So I am very keen for Malta to, build on what they've done, which I think is generally speaking, very good. I'm keen for them to make sure that they don't mess it up.
There have been these calls, maybe, that psychedelics are now the new cannabis, and that certain parts of the world, they're looking at regularization for recreational and medical use of psychedelics. Do you think that now's the time for psychedelics to be legalized for these uses around the world?
Sure. I mean, I think the same critique of the failings of a prohibitionist approach and the failings of the war on drugs that have been well rehearsed in the cannabis debate to a significant extent apply to other drugs too. If people are using these other drugs, prohibiting them and criminalizing those people, it's not stopping them use the drugs, it's making the drugs more dangerous, it's imposing the harms of criminalization on these people, it's handing control of the markets to organized crime groups and street dealers. And there are no obvious benefits and lots of obvious costs. So the arguments that have been applied to cannabis, I think, apply to other drugs as well. And the reforms that are happening with cannabis, and the fact that those reforms are now delivering positive outcomes in other countries around the world, and I'm confident that they will be delivering positive outcomes in Malta in the coming years, suggests that it's opening up some space for a wider discussion on reform of other drugs, and perhaps inevitably psychedelic drugs, things like magic mushrooms in particular, are perhaps the first other drugs that people are seriously considering. The reason for that is because psychedelic drugs are, like cannabis, not safe. They're obviously associated with risks, but they are at the lower end of the risk spectrum amongst other drugs. So they are relatively safer than, say, cocaine or heroin or methamphetamine or some of the drugs which are more associated with higher levels of risk. Magic mushrooms, people don't overdose and die on them. They're not addictive in the same way that alcohol or cocaine or heroin can be. They're relatively easy to produce, they're quite cheap, they're quite easy to dose. And, in places where they have been legal or quasi-legal, they're not associated with significant problems. Not zero problems. And I'm not pro magic mushroom use here. I'm just being pragmatic. In the UK, magic mushrooms were legal from 2003 to 2005, and there was an open market in magic mushrooms. It wasn't even regulated at all. Nothing really bad happened. There was an increase in magic mushroom use, but there was a decrease in use of some other drugs. So people moved from some illegal drugs to magic mushrooms, and in many ways that was a positive public health step, because they were moving from maybe more risky drugs to a less risky drug. But there were nobody was dying, nobody was getting addicted, people weren't taking magic mushrooms and crashing their cars all over the place. There was no kind of negative public health footprint, even though that market was completely unregulated. Anyway, they then banned magic mushrooms, and they are still banned in the UK, but they are legal, for example, in the Netherlands. You can still buy psilocybin truffles in head shops. Some people use them. They are not associated with the significant public health harms. It seems like a natural next step to, in terms of the political discourse, for a discussion on a drug like psychedelic drugs to be a natural next choice, because they are less threatening. I mean, if you were trying to make an argument for legalizing cocaine or legalizing amphetamines or MDMA or something, drugs which are more associated in the public mind with addiction or with death or with risks, it's a much harder argument to make. I mean, I still think these are important arguments to make, and they are happening. In the Netherlands, for example, there is an active debate around regulating MDMA or ecstasy. In Colombia, there is an active debate around regulating the coca leaf and about regulating cocaine powder, at least within Colombia.
And these steps, regulating the regulations of various other drugs, so apart from psychedelics.
Yeah.
So do you think it's the solution to ending the war on drugs, ending the power of organized crime?
I think in the long term, yes, I think it is. These are difficult debates, and I'm not saying Malta should be rushing into saying, yes, let's have a debate around legalizing cocaine. I'm not saying that. But inevitably in the future, I think we will need to have these discussions. I don't think there's a slippery slope. I don't think there's an inevitability to that. But if we can show that regulated cannabis is a success, it creates space to have that discussion around other drugs. it makes sense that it begins with the lower risk drugs like magic mushrooms, and that is happening. So in Colorado, they have now passed a decriminalization law around magic mushrooms, so you can grow your own magic mushrooms, a bit like in Malta with cannabis, and you can use them and you can share them amongst your friends, and they are now effectively accessible not just for medical use but for non-medical use as well. Oregon, another state in the US, similarly has a decriminalized magic mushroom policy. In fact, there are a number of countries around the world where magic mushrooms were never really criminalized anyway. So in Jamaica, for example, fresh magic mushrooms are not criminalized. You can just grow and use them. And like I say, there was a brief period where magic mushrooms were legal in the UK. Nothing really bad happened, but they banned them anyway. It was a political decision rather than a sort of public health evidence-based decision. In the Netherlands, they still have psilocybin truffles, which is kind of the underground bits of magic mushrooms, are legal. They're not, there wasn't like an explosion of use of, but they've been legal for a long time. Some people use them, most people don't. It's not a particularly big deal or big thing. Nothing bad's happened. There hasn't been a kind of epidemic of mushroom addiction or anything ridiculous like that. So I think we can certainly have that discussion. Whether that discussion happens in Malta, I have no idea. But I think the important thing for Malta now is to focus on the cannabis reforms and to make them work. To stay true to the principles that underpin the reform. The principles of harm reduction and crime reduction and public health and public safety, and avoiding the risks of commercialization. And being pragmatic, following the evidence, doing what works, kind of avoiding the ideology of the past, the sort of war on drugs ideology where all drug use was evil and people who use drugs were bad people and they must be punished. These are concepts from another time. They're not relevant to the modern world. As policymakers, we have to deal with reality, and the reality is that people use drugs. Not all people, but some people use drugs, whether we like it or not. Some people use cannabis, and we have to deal with the world as we find it, not the world that we wish we lived in. And that means responsibly regulating that market, responsibly regulating that use, to reduce the harms that it causes, and maybe to even maximize the benefits, because some people clearly derive benefits from their cannabis use, whether it's medical benefits or relaxation or pleasure. It's like with alcohol, we try and regulate these things in a responsible way. We don't always do a very good job with alcohol. I think we could do a much better job in Malta with alcohol and in much of the world. Arguably, we've done a better job with tobacco. So you can see with tobacco, we've banned advertising, we've banned smoking in public spaces, we've increased the age access to buy tobacco, we've banned vending machines, and we've actually introduced a whole series of controls on tobacco, like pictures of cancerous lungs saying this is bad for you on the packet. Tobacco use has gone down, and we've invested in public health education. What we haven't done is criminalise tobacco users. We haven't criminalised anybody for smoking tobacco, and tobacco is still legal to buy. But tobacco use is going down, even though it's a legal product, at the same time that many illegal drug use is going up. So if cocaine use is going up and it's illegal, tobacco use is going down and it's legal, maybe there's a lesson there.